Friday night, 8:45. The most exclusive steakhouse in Manhattan. And every single eye in that room was staring at her feet. Clara moved between the tables carrying a tray of drinks, her black flats cracked at the toe, a strip of silver duct tape barely holding the left sole together. Around her, crystal glasses clinked, linen napkins unfolded across laps that wore $10,000 suits, and candlelight bounced off jewelry that cost more than her rent for a year. From the corner booth, a hand went up. Two sharp snaps of the fingers, like someone summoning a dog. Gerald Ashford. Silver hair slicked back. Charcoal suit with a faint pinstripe. A gold Rolex that caught the candlelight every time he moved his wrist. He was 62 years old, and he had never once in his life waited for anything. Mississippi, Mississippi. Come here. Clara approached. She set down his bourbon, neat, exactly the way he ordered it every Friday. Gerald didn't look at her face. He looked down at her shoes. A smirk crawled across his mouth. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it, deliberately, on the floor at her feet. Buy yourself some real shoes, sweetheart. You're embarrassing my guests. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the laughter came. Not from one table. From 3. Gerald's guests, his associates, his sycophants. They laughed because he laughed, the way small people always do around a man with a big wallet. Clara's knuckles went white around the tray. But she didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She bent down, picked up the $100 bill, folded it once, and placed it back on his table. I don't need your money, sir. Gerald's smirk vanished for just a half second, replaced by something harder. Irritation. Then he waved her away with the back of his hand, the way you'd brush a crumb off your sleeve. She walked back to the kitchen with her chin up and her hands trembling. And Gerald Ashford went back to his steak. He had already forgotten her. That was his first mistake. Behind the kitchen doors, Clara leaned against the stainless steel counter, eyes closed, breathing through it. The sounds of clattering dishes, shouting cooks, and the roar of the commercial dishwasher filled the space around her. Maria, an older server, 50-something, with kind eyes and a stained apron, put a hand on Clara's shoulder. Don't let him get to you, Mija. Men like that, they don't see people. They see furniture. Clara opened her eyes. She reached up and touched something at her neck. A small tarnished bronze key on a thin chain, half hidden under her collar. She wrapped her fingers around it and squeezed. Clara Maddox had been waiting tables at the Carrington Room for 14 months. She worked the dinner shift 5 nights a week. She took every extra section anyone would give her. She never called in sick. And she never, not once, told a single soul her real last name. Her father was Russell Maddox. If you searched that name, you'd find newspaper clippings and magazine covers tucked away in archives. Maddox Holdings acquires 3rd Avenue corridor. The quiet giant, Russell Maddox, and his $4.2 billion empire. Reclusive developer shuns spotlight. Russell Maddox owned more commercial real estate in New York City than most people could locate on a map. 47 buildings. 12 city blocks. He had started as a bricklayer in Queens. Calluses on every finger, concrete dust in his lungs. And he built an empire with his bare hands over 40 years. But here was the thing about Russell Maddox. He never appeared on television. He never attended galas. He never put his face on the side of a building. He believed that wealth was a tool, not a trophy. And he raised his daughter to believe the same thing. When Clara was 16, her father sat her down at the kitchen table of their modest home in Astoria. He slid a small bronze key across the table to her. This key opens the original deed vault. Everything I've built is in there. But I'm not giving it to you as a gift, Clara. I'm giving it to you as a test. Before you ever touch what's inside, I want you to go out and work. Real work. The kind that makes your back ache and your pride hurt. Because if you can't respect the people who serve, you don't deserve to lead the people who build. Clara closed her hand around that key, and she made a promise. That was 6 years ago. She had kept every word of it. She worked as a janitor in a hospital for 8 months, mopping floors at 3 in the morning, cleaning up things nobody should have to describe. She drove a delivery truck through 2 brutal winters, fingers so cold she couldn't feel the steering wheel. She filed papers in a courthouse basement where the lights flickered and the heat didn't work. And then, 14 months ago, she took a job waiting tables at the restaurant that sat directly on top of one of her father's most valuable properties. She never told the manager. She never told the chef. She wore her cracked shoes and her plain apron, and she served people who had less money in their entire accounts than she had in her name. And she served them with respect. Because that was the point. She endured that cruelty for one heartbreaking reason. A promise she made to the man who built everything from nothing. But Gerald Ashford didn't know any of this. To him, Clara was invisible. Just another pair of cheap shoes carrying his dinner. 3 months later, Clara sat in her small studio apartment, early morning light cutting through the window. The place was spare, a single bed, neatly made, a folding table with a laptop. On the wall hung a framed photograph of her father standing in front of a construction site, hard hat in hand, smiling with those kind, tired eyes. Next to the photo, pinned to the wall, a handwritten note on yellowed paper. "Earn it, Dad." She picked up her phone and called the only number that mattered. "Dad, I'm ready." On the other end, Russell Maddox, 71 years old now, sat behind a wooden desk piled with folders in a converted brownstone that served as his office. Not a penthouse, not a glass tower, a brownstone. He wore a flannel shirt, no Rolex, no cufflinks, just a ceramic mug that read, "World's Okayest Dad," and a lifetime of calluses that never fully healed. He smiled into the phone. "Then it's time to come home." Clara stepped into Maddox Holdings not as an heiress, but as a junior project manager. She started at the bottom of her own father's company. She answered phones. She organized files. She sat at a folding table in a warehouse with lawyers, pointing at building plans. She walked properties in work boots and a hard hat. She reviewed tenant contracts, shook hands with building superintendents, and visited families in rent-stabilized apartments to ask what they needed, not what they owed. Russell wouldn't have it any other way. She would learn every brick, every lease, every handshake that held the empire together, from the ground up, the way he did. And while Clara was learning to build, Gerald Ashford was learning what it felt like to fall. He had overextended. Too many vanity projects. A hotel in Dubai that hemorrhaged money every quarter. A casino deal in Atlantic City that collapsed 3 weeks before opening. His penthouse office with the glass walls and the skyline view became a cage. He paced. He shouted into phones. Papers piled up on his desk, marked in red. Loan default notices. Risk assessments stamped, over-leveraged. His assistant would set down another folder, and Gerald would throw it across the room. The banks were circling. Gerald needed cash. Fast. And to get it, he needed to refinance the leases on his most valuable properties. Properties that sat on land he didn't own. Land that belonged, every last square foot of it, to Maddox Holdings. Gerald Ashford didn't own the ground under his own feet. He never had. He leased it. And for 20 years, those leases had been quietly, patiently managed by a man Gerald had never met and never bothered to look up. Because men like Gerald didn't look down at the foundation. They only looked up at their own name on the building. One evening, Russell Maddox sat alone in his office, reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing Gerald Ashford's financials. He circled a number on the page. He picked up the phone. By his paper. All of it. Every note. Every loan. Quietly. Over 6 months, Maddox Holdings acquired Gerald Ashford's debt, piece by piece, note by note, through a web of holding companies so discreet that Gerald never heard a whisper. Not a rumor, not a warning, not a single phone call. And the whole time, Clara watched. She studied, and she waited. Gerald Ashford's annual investor gala. Town cars lined up outside the Carrington Room, the same restaurant. Red carpet rolled out. Men in tuxedos stepped through the doors. Women in gowns trailed perfume that cost more per ounce than gold. Inside, the restaurant had been transformed. Ice sculptures, a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner, champagne towers on every table. And at the center of it all, Gerald Ashford, fresh haircut, custom tuxedo, shaking hands, laughing too loud, making promises he couldn't keep to the 12 most powerful investors in New York. This was his night. The night he would convince every person in that room that the Ashford Group was strong, that the future was golden. He had rehearsed his speech 11 times. He had picked the wine personally. He had chosen this restaurant, his favorite, because it made him feel powerful. He had no idea he was standing on borrowed ground. In every possible sense. The front door opened. The noise of the party dimmed for just a moment. Clara walked in. She was not wearing an apron. She wore a simple black dress. Elegant, understated, nothing flashy. No jewelry except one piece. The tarnished bronze key on the chain around her neck. And on her feet, the same cracked black flats, held together with duct tape. The very same pair. The hostess looked confused. A security guard stepped forward. Clara handed him a card. He read it. His eyes widened. He stepped aside immediately. She moved through the room with a calm that didn't belong there. Heads turned, not because she was glamorous, but because there was something about the way she carried herself. Steady, unhurried, like someone who already knew how the evening was going to end. Gerald spotted her from across the floor. He squinted. Something flickered behind his eyes. A half-memory, a fragment. He couldn't place her. Then his gaze dropped to her shoes, and his face changed. He remembered. You're that waitress. He let out a disbelieving half-laugh. What are you doing here? This is a private event. Clara reached into a leather folio she carried under her arm. She pulled out a single folder. She placed it on the white tablecloth in front of Gerald. Then, slowly, she reached up, unclasped the bronze key from her neck, and set it on top of the folder. The clink of metal on wood silenced every table within 15 feet. My name is Clara Maddox. My father is Russell Maddox. Maddox Holdings is the majority stakeholder in your debt portfolio, Mr. Ashford. That folder contains lease termination notices for every property your company occupies on Maddox land. You have 90 days. Dead silence. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Gerald picked up the folder. His hands were shaking. He flipped it open. Pages of legal documents. Red stamps. His company name everywhere. He looked up at Clara. Every drop of color had drained from his face. Around the table, his investors shifted. One was already pulling out his phone. Another pushed his chair back from the table. A third closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. You can't do this. Gerald's voice cracked. I have contracts. You have leases, Mr. Ashford. Leases on land you never owned. And those leases have a review clause, triggered by change of debt ownership, which happened 4 months ago. Gerald's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked around the room for support, for someone to say something, for anyone to back him up. His investors wouldn't meet his eyes. The look on his face changed from arrogance to pure fear. And she wasn't even finished. Stay with me here, because what she did next is something most people would never have the strength to do. Clara didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She pulled out a second document from the folio and placed it beside the first. But my father wanted me to give you this as well. Gerald looked down. It was a single page. A restructuring offer. The terms were firm but fair. Maddox Holdings would not terminate the leases if Gerald agreed to 3 conditions. First, a full public apology to every member of his staff, from the executives to the dishwashers. Second, a worker dignity initiative across all Ashford properties, overseen by an independent board. And third, Condition 3, every server, janitor, and dishwasher in every Ashford property gets a living wage. Effective immediately. Not because it's good business, Mr. Ashford. Because they're human beings. And you've been treating them like furniture. Gerald stared at the paper. His jaw was tight. The room was watching. From the far end of the table, one of his investors, an older woman in a navy gown, began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. Then another pair of hands joined. Then another. The room rippled with quiet, firm applause. Clara picked the bronze key up off the table. She clasped it back around her neck. She turned to walk away. Then she paused, looked back over her shoulder. And for the record, I bought these shoes with my own money. $12 at a thrift store on Flatbush Avenue. They've walked me through more honest work than your Rolex has ever seen. She walked out. The cracked flats clicked against the marble floor. The door closed behind her, and Gerald Ashford sat alone at his table, the folder open in front of him, his empire resting on a single signature. If that moment gave you chills, smash that like button and hit subscribe. We tell stories here about real justice, real dignity, and real people who refuse to be stepped on. Join this family so you never miss one. Outside, the night air was cool. Clara stepped onto the sidewalk. A town car was waiting at the curb, but she walked right past it. She pulled out her phone. Hey, Dad. It's done. Russell Maddox was at home. Not a mansion. A small house in Astoria, the same one he'd owned for 30 years. He sat in his recliner, a dog curled at his feet, reading glasses still on. How do you feel? Clara paused, took a breath, smiled. Like I earned it. She hung up. She walked down the street alone. The city hummed around her. Yellow cabs, steam rising from a grate. A pretzel vendor closing up his cart for the night. She stopped, bought the last pretzel, and sat on a bench to eat it, the bronze key resting against her chest, the city lights reflected in her eyes. Gerald Ashford signed the agreement 3 days later. Every employee across his properties received a raise. He issued a public apology, written, televised, and verified by an independent oversight committee. His empire survived. Barely. But his reputation, the one built on intimidation and cruelty and snapping his fingers at people he considered beneath him, that didn't survive. And it shouldn't have. Across Ashford properties, workers received new contracts. A janitor in one of Gerald's office towers read his pay stub and covered his mouth with his hand. A dishwasher in one of his restaurants showed her first new check to her teenage daughter, and the girl hugged her so hard they both nearly fell over. Small moments. Real moments. The kind that don't make headlines, but change lives. Clara Maddox went back to work the following Monday, not at the restaurant. At Maddox Holdings. She started as a project manager. Not the CEO, not the president. A project manager. She still wore those shoes for another 6 months, until they finally fell apart for good. When they did, she had them framed. Put them on a shelf in her office, right next to the photograph of her dad at the construction site. Right next to that ceramic mug that read, "World's Okayest Dad." And Russell Maddox? He never met Gerald Ashford. Never wanted to. He said there was no point in meeting a man who measures people by what's on their feet instead of what's in their chest. Gerald Ashford learned something that night that cost him more than money. He learned that you can buy a suit, but you cannot buy class. You can lease a building, but you cannot lease respect. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? And I mean that literally. Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who tried to make you feel small, or someone who lifted you up when the world looked down, share this video with them. Send it to a friend who needs to hear it tonight. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders of who we should be and who we should never become. Now I'll leave you with this. My grandfather laid bricks. My father built buildings. And they both taught me the same thing. You can always tell the measure of a person by how they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them. Dedicated to every person who was made to feel small by someone with a big title.